Yes, hello again. Welcome back once more to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where, as you know, the main purpose of this channel is to showcase more of those old school vintage dirt bikes from way back in the day. Now, we do like to feature all kinds of off-roaders here on CDB TV, but it has to be said that the nucleus of this channel is based around old vintage scrambles or motocross machines, but we do from time to time feature enduro bikes as well, which is exactly what we're going to do right now as we take a look at another lovely machine from the Terry Pickering Classic Dirt Bike collection. And this is another one of Terry's fantastic machines from his vast compendium of old motorcycles. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into this video and take a look at Terry's lovely 1980 PE175 Suzuki. Now, it's certainly not that often that we get the chance to feature classic enduro off-roaders here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, and that's not because we're biased in any way towards enduro machines. It's just that through the many years that I've been capturing these older dirt bikes, I've never really come across enough of them, so hopefully we'll be able to put that right straight away as we check out this old school classic. So this 1980 Suzuki PE175 Enduro bike is another classic from the Terry Pickering off-road motorcycle collection. Now, Terry, as you know, has some of the nicest and rarest old motocross bikes in his vast collection of motorcycles, and some of which are still unused from the 1970s and 80s, and he also has a comprehensive assortment of bikes that have been fully restored either by himself or his bike building friend Keith Ree. But this featured PE175 Suzuki is actually one of the bikes that Terry hasn't restored, as he said he purchased this bike some years ago in this very same condition, and as far as we know, the bike's never had any kind of refurbishment or restoration work done in its life, and it still looks as fresh as it did back in 1980. Now, as I remember, these PE175s were launched way back in 1978 as the demand for trail bikes was becoming increasingly popular, especially in the USA, where the likes of the Penton KTMs and Can-Ams and, of course, the hugely successful Yamaha IT175 were already well established. And in the late 1970s, Suzuki thought it was about time that they joined the competition with their PE series of enduro trail bikes. And so these PEs, or pure enduro, to give them their full title, basically raided Suzuki's parts bins as they used a frame and a motor that was borrowed from the motocross RM125 of the late 1970s, although these 1980 models did have some upgrades for that year, in that the frame was strengthened and the rear swing arm was also changed from a heavier steel unit to this beefed up alloy box section swing arm. And if you were looking for a go anywhere machine that you could use on either enduro events, motocross, or even just a little bit of green laning, then these little PEs could certainly do it all, because they had a decent chassis and maybe not the best suspension of an off-roader for its days, although that very small compact 175cc two-stroke motor was certainly a peach, and it had more than enough horses to keep a grin on your face. Now, of all of the many bikes that Terry has in his vast collection of vintage motorcycles, and this PE175 Suzuki is his bike of choice if he wants to do some green laning or maybe take part in a vintage enduro event. And the bike does get well used and is on constant standby, even if Terry just wants to nip down to the shops. And so as we take a look at the PE175's two-stroke motor, which was again upgraded for 1980, as the cylinder head and barrel was a redesigned part from the previous 1979 model, although this power plant was still essentially an engine from an RM125 that had been bored out to 175cc, and it's also kept the RM's 6-speed gearbox and clutch as well. Now again, also on this engine there was a certain amount of magnesium used on the engine casings of these little PEs to try and just keep the overall weight of the bike down to the minimum, but for a small compact two-stroke power plant this was a decent motor for enduro use. Now the sparks for our 175 PE Suzuki motor were supplied by Suzuki's PEI unit, or pointless electronic ignition, to give it its full title, and the fuel for that Suzuki motor was fed by a VM34 Mikuni carburetor, which also drew its air supply through a foam filter that was housed inside this plastic airbox. But these 175 motors were very well put together, and by all accounts they were reasonably powerful and quite reliable as well. Now, also bolted on to our 1980 PE175 Suzuki bike, these had a completely redesigned exhaust system from the previous 1979 bike, as it said that the older exhausts tended to choke the motor and then reduce its overall power. So Suzuki then redesigned the expansion chamber with a brand new layout, and of course the rear silencer was also new to allow the motor to breathe better, and of course keep the engine's bark to a minimum, because after all this is an enduro machine, so it could spend much of its time riding on public highways, so its exhaust note had to be kept in check. Although overall, for a smaller, lightweight enduro power plant, these compact 175 two-stroke Suzuki motors were well suited for use as a smaller enduro bike, because they were still essentially a bored-out RM125 motocross engine with a new redesigned barrel and head for 1980, which of course gave the motor almost an extra 5 horsepower over the previous 1979 engine. Now, once again, Suzuki gave the 1980 PE increased fork travel for this year, and these front forks were still pretty basic suspension units, but Suzuki added Schrader valve air caps to the top of each fork stanchion so that you could add or remove low pressure air, so that you could either stiffen or soften the fork's overall compression. And once again, as you can see, simple old school drum front brakes on our PE175, which were still decent stoppers for their time, that were more than up for the job of slowing down our little enduro bike. And naturally it wouldn't be too long before Suzuki were then fitting the more powerful hydraulic disc brakes on all of their off-road motocross and enduro machines. Now, once more, back in 1980, the rear shocks that would have been fitted to these PEs were not fantastic, but they still did their job, despite them being quite hard and had little in the way of suspension travel and adjustment. Now, whether these rear shocks here are still the originals, I'm not entirely sure, but they certainly look right and period correct for that year. But again, you have to remember that this was the suspension technology of its day. Now, as I said previously, another brand new part on the 1980 PE for that year was the switch from a tubular steel swing arm to this beefed up alloy box section swing arm, which was reputed to be lighter and stronger than the older 79 item. But in my personal opinion, these types of alloy swing arms still did have a tendency for cracking if they were subject to a hard life of bouncing around after years of abuse on the racetrack. Now, once again, these PE175s did have a decent sized 10 litre fuel tank on them for 1980. Now, much bigger, of course, than the smaller RM motocross fuel cells, as this enduro bike had a much greater distance to cover than the relatively short sprints that would have been associated with the motocross machines of its day. And once again, for the longer distances that these bikes would have to cover, it was imperative, of course, to have a decent seat to rest your backside on between timed sections. And these PE175 seats were certainly one of the most comfortable in its class for that year, as it was both supportive and relatively soft. And if you're an enduro rider yourself, then you'll know how important this particular part is on any kind of enduro race bike. Now, naturally, you can't have an enduro bike without a full lighting kit, and this little Susie here had a nice tidy arrangement at the front with the incorporated headlight front number plate and that all-important wire headlight guard, just in case it got damaged with maybe a tree branch or other obstacles while riding in the woods. But again, if my aging memory serves me correctly, I can remember that these headlight number plate plastics had a little mounting at the rear where you could hook on either a plug spanner or maybe a couple of other important tools should you need them in a hurry. And once again, of course, you can't have a fully road legal enduro bike without a fully working speedometer, which of course is a legal requirement if you want to use your PE enduro bike on the UK roads, just of course so as you don't upset the local Keystone cops, and just to try and keep your speed below that legal limit. But a nice set of Pro Grip rubber grips here on Terry's PE with what looks like a set of Magura ball end clutch and front brake levers, and of course that all-important side pull throttle gasser twist grip just to keep tabs on the speed of that Suzuki engine. Now, also at the back end of our 1980p Suzuki, a decent stop tail light to once again meet with the legal requirements of driving the bike on the UK public highways. And finally, one of the other handy fitments on these PE Suzukis was the addition of a side stand, which of course meant that you could either park the bike up anywhere, whether it was in the middle of maybe a car park or somewhere else in the woods. But of course, back in 1980, you didn't have to stick with this smaller 175, as Suzuki also had available a 250 and even a 400cc PE model, which again were all basically based around the RM motocrossers of their day. But after about 6 years of decent sales across the USA and in Europe, the last of the PE Suzukis rolled off the production line in 1984. But although Suzuki were quite late to the enduro party when they launched their first PE back in 1978. They still managed to catch up and take on the likes of Yamaha's IT175 and, of course, those Penton KTMs that were hugely popular at that time, and those bikes were already established as the class leaders for that period. But I have to say that this example here of Terry's is certainly an original looking PE from 1980, especially for a bike that's neither had any kind of refurbishment or restoration in its 42 years as an enduro racer. And this bike, as I said, is just one of the many vintage race bikes in Terry's superb collection of old school enduro and scrambles machines. And if you're a regular visitor, or better still, a subscriber to CDB TV, then look out for more shining examples from Terry's Aladdin's Cave of Motorcycles, which will be coming very soon to my CDB TV YouTube channel. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that short clip. Something for all you enduro fans out there. A nice 1980 PE175 Suzuki, a bike that's of course part of the massive Terry Pickering motorcycle collection, and we will of course be featuring more of Terry's machines in forthcoming videos here on my channel. Now, just in case you haven't noticed, YouTube have allowed me to add a super thanks button to my videos, whereby any of my subscribers or even viewers can add a little gratuity towards the upkeep of my channel, because it does take many hours and lots of traveling to bring you these classic bikes here on my channel. So any gratuity that you'd like to leave would be very much appreciated. So coming up in my next video posting, we're going to go back to the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and we'll be taking a look at this lovely 1979 370 SWM. Now, this was just one of the very nice bikes that were at the show over the course of those 2 days. So we'll be taking a look at this Italian SWM when we return to CDB TV. But until then, of course, everybody out there, be safe while you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes, and I hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.